I've been in prison for 6 years. He took my son's life, and I took his. That's how things go in this world. Everything comes with a price. And sadly, all of this happens simply because we're black.
In this episode, we hear the story of a mother who is serving time in prison. Sometimes, what happens in life isn't only the result of your own mistakes, and this is one of those cases. So why would someone end up in prison simply for being black? In just a moment, you'll understand everything. Before we continue, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This helps the video reach more people and may help prevent a life from being lost behind prison walls. Born Marlene Thompson in 1978, she grew up in a working-class family where education was everything. Her parents, both teachers in the Atlanta public school system, instilled in her the belief that schools were sacred spaces, places where children should feel safe, protected, and valued. This belief would later become the very foundation of her tragic mission. Marlene met David Washington during their sophomore year at Clark Atlanta University, where she was studying social work, and he was pursuing mechanical engineering. Friends described their relationship as steady and supportive, built on shared values about family and community. They married in 2002, settled in a modest ranch house in Decatur, and began building the life they had always dreamed of. The Washingtons were known in their neighborhood as the couple who organized block parties, who volunteered at local food banks, and who always had their front porch light on for any child who needed help. Marlene worked as a social worker for Fulton County, specializing in family crisis intervention. Her colleagues remember her as someone who fought tirelessly for vulnerable families, often working unpaid overtime. When their son Marcus was born in 2007, Marlene temporarily stepped back from full-time work to focus on motherhood. She became the parent who organized playdates, who knew every teacher's name, and who volunteered for every school fundraiser. Marcus was her world, a bright, curious boy who loved reading comic books and building elaborate Lego constructions. David worked as a project manager for a construction company, and while money was sometimes tight, the Washingtons prioritized experiences over material things. They took Marcus on camping trips to the Georgia mountains, visited museums in Atlanta, and spent countless summer evenings in their backyard, teaching him to tend the vegetable garden. Friends and family described the Washingtons as a close-knit unit. Marlene's sister, Patricia, would later testify that Marlene was the kind of mother who knew exactly what homework Marcus had each night, who attended every parent-teacher conference, and who could sense when something was bothering her son. The family attended Mount Olive Baptist Church every Sunday, where Marlene sang in the choir and Marcus participated in the youth ministry. Pastor James Mitchell described Marlene as someone who embodied the spirit of Christian service and who would give her last dollar to help a child in need. Marcus was enrolled at Jefferson Elementary School in 2013 when he entered kindergarten. The school had a good reputation in the district, with test scores above average and what appeared to be a caring staff. Marlene felt confident about her choice. For the first few years, everything seemed to go according to plan. Marcus made friends easily, excelled in his studies, and showed particular talent in art and creative writing. His teachers praised his maturity and kindness toward other students. But by fourth grade, something began to change. Marcus became quieter at home, less enthusiastic about school, and started complaining of headaches and stomach problems that doctors couldn't explain. When Marlene asked about his day, he would give short answers. Marlene's background in social work had taught her to recognize the warning signs of a child in distress, but Marcus was skilled at hiding his pain. The family that had once shared everything was beginning to fracture under the weight of secrets. What Marlene didn't know was that her son was experiencing something that no parent should ever have to imagine. To understand how Marlene Washington became capable of taking another person's life, we must first understand profound love that shaped her identity as a mother and the devastating betrayal that would ultimately destroy her faith in the very institutions she had dedicated her life to serving. Marlene's own childhood had been marked by stability, community, and the unwavering belief that education was the pathway to opportunity. Growing up in Southwest Atlanta during the 1980s and 1990s, she was surrounded by teachers, principals, and education professionals who treated their work as a calling rather than simply a job. Her parents, Robert and Dorothy Thompson, both taught in the Atlanta public school system for over 30 years. This upbringing created in Marlene a deep reverence for educators and an unshakable belief that schools were sanctuaries where children were protected, nurtured, and given the tools to build better lives. When she chose to pursue social work in college, it was a natural extension of the values her parents had instilled, a commitment to advocating for children. During her college years at Clark Atlanta University, Marlene was known for her passionate participation in community service projects. She tutored children in local elementary schools, volunteered at homeless shelters, and spent her spring breaks working with Habitat for Humanity instead of vacationing with friends. Her professors remember her as a student who understood that social work wasn't just a career choice. When she met David Washington during their sophomore year, she found a partner who shared her values and her vision for the future. David had grown up in a military family, moving frequently during his childhood, and he was drawn to Marlene's deep roots in the Atlanta community. Their relationship was built on long conversations about the kind of family they wanted to build. After graduation, Marlene threw herself into her work with Fulton County Child and Family Services with the same passion she had shown in college. Her caseload was heavy, dealing primarily with families in crisis, children who had been neglected or abused, parents struggling with addiction or mental health issues. The work was emotionally demanding, but Marlene found it deeply fulfilling. When Marcus was born in 2007, Marlene experienced a transformation that many working mothers know well. The sudden realization that all of her professional knowledge paled in comparison to the overwhelming love and protective instinct she felt for her own child. She temporarily reduced her caseload to part-time status, wanting to be present for every milestone. Marcus was an easy baby who grew into a curious and affectionate toddler. Marlene documented every moment of his childhood with the enthusiasm of a first-time mother. Photo albums filled with pictures of his first steps, his first words, his first day of preschool. She read to him every night and created elaborate birthday parties. As Marcus grew older, Marlene began to see reflections of both herself and David in his personality. He had inherited her empathy and emotional intelligence, always quick to comfort a friend who was upset. From David, he had gained a love of building and creating things with his hands, spending hours constructing intricate Lego cities. The transition to elementary school seemed natural and exciting for Marcus. He was academically ready, socially confident, and eager to start this new chapter. Marlene had carefully researched schools in their district, visiting campuses and talking to other parents. Jefferson Elementary School seemed like the perfect fit. During Marcus's first few years at Jefferson, Marlene felt confident in her choice. His teachers sent home glowing reports about his academic progress and his kindness toward classmates. He made friends easily, participated enthusiastically in school programs, and came home each day with stories about what he learned. Marlene became heavily involved in the school community, volunteering for reading programs and serving on the Parent-Teacher Association board. She knew most of the teachers by name and felt like a valued partner in her son's education. But somewhere during Marcus's third grade year, subtle changes began to appear. He started asking more questions about why some children looked different from others and why some people seemed to be treated differently. Marlene answered these questions honestly, using her social work background to explain concepts of diversity and equity. The changes became more pronounced in fourth grade. Marcus began complaining of stomach aches on Sunday nights, reluctance that Marlene initially attributed to typical end-of-weekend blues. He started asking if he could stay home from school more frequently, citing headaches that seemed to disappear by afternoon. Most concerning to Marlene was a change in Marcus's communication style. The boy who had once shared every detail of his day began giving one-word answers to questions about school. It was during one of Marcus's therapy sessions in early 2019 that the full scope of what had happened at Jefferson Elementary finally came to light. With the help of a skilled counselor, Marcus was finally able to articulate the systematic racial harassment he had endured, the physical assaults he had suffered, and the institutional neglect that had enabled his tormentors. When Marlene learned the truth about her son's experiences, she felt a rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. The woman who had dedicated her career protecting vulnerable children realized that the very system she had trusted protect her own child had not only failed him, but had actively participated in covering up the abuse. She immediately contacted Jefferson Elementary to demand accountability for what had happened to Marcus. Principal Coleman's response was to deny any knowledge of racial harassment and to suggest that Marcus might have misremembered events due to the stress of changing schools. His dismissive attitude and refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing pushed Marlene's anger into dangerous territory. The woman who had once believed in justice through proper channels had lost faith in every institution that was supposed to protect children like her son. October 15th, 2019 began like any other Monday at Jefferson Elementary School. Principal Robert Coleman arrived at his usual time of 7:30 a.m., carrying his coffee and the weekend's worth of administrative paperwork that had accumulated in his inbox. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal morning of his life, or that the woman who had once trusted him to protect her child was already on her way to settle a debt that had been growing for over a year. Marlene Washington had spent the previous evening in what can only be described as a state of calm determination. She had kissed Marcus goodnight, helped him with his homework, and tucked him into bed as she had done thousands of times before. But unlike those other nights, she had also loaded the .38 caliber revolver that David kept in their bedroom safe and placed it carefully in her purse. The gun was not something she was unfamiliar with. David had insisted on firearms training for both of them after a series of break-ins in their neighborhood several years earlier, and Marlene had become a competent marksman during their monthly visits to the shooting range. She understood the weight of the weapon in her hands and the finality of the action she was contemplating. Her morning routine proceeded with an eerie normalcy that would later disturb investigators who reviewed the security footage from her apartment building. She made breakfast for Marcus, packed his lunch with the same care she always showed, and drove him to his current school with the same maternal attention to his seatbelt and backpack that characterized all of their interactions. After dropping Marcus off, Marlene sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes, apparently wrestling with a decision that would define the remainder of her life. Witnesses later reported seeing her speaking to herself, occasionally shaking her head, and at one point appearing to cry. But whatever internal debate was taking place, it ended with her starting the engine and driving directly to Jefferson Elementary School. She arrived at the school at approximately 9:15 a.m. during the morning instruction period when most staff and students were in their classrooms. The main office was staffed by Secretary Janet Morrison and Volunteer Coordinator Lisa Park, both of whom knew Marlene from her previous involvement with the school and greeted her warmly when she entered. Marlene's demeanor appeared calm and professional as she informed Ms. Morrison that she needed to speak with Principal Coleman about an urgent matter regarding her son's former enrollment. This was not an unusual request, as parents occasionally returned to address concerns or retrieve records, and Morrison buzzed Coleman's office to announce the visitor. Principal Coleman emerged from his office with the same practiced smile he used for all parental interactions, though those who knew him well later noted that he seemed more tired than usual and had mentioned being stressed about upcoming district evaluations. He greeted Marlene cordially and invited her into his office for what he assumed would be a routine conversation. The exact details of what transpired in Coleman's office during the following 12 minutes would become a matter of intense legal debate, as no recording devices captured the conversation and no witnesses were present. What is known comes from Marlene's own statements, given both immediately after the shooting and during her subsequent trial testimony. According to Marlene's account, she began by calmly outlining Marcus's experiences at Jefferson Elementary, including the racial harassment, physical assaults, and systematic institutional neglect that had characterized his time at the school. She presented Coleman with a detailed timeline of incidents and a copy of Marcus's therapy records that documented the lasting trauma he had endured. Coleman's response, as Marlene described it, was to deny any knowledge of racial harassment and to suggest that she was looking for someone to blame for problems that were probably happening at home. He allegedly accused her of being an overprotective mother who was teaching her son to see racism where none existed. It was at this point, according to Marlene's testimony, that Coleman made the comment that sealed his fate. When she pressed him about his failure to investigate the bathroom incident, he allegedly replied, "Maybe if you people would teach your children to handle their own problems instead of always crying victim, they wouldn't have these issues." The racial undertones of this comment, combined with Coleman's dismissive attitude toward Marcus's suffering, triggered something in Marlene that she later described as a moment of complete clarity. She realized, she said, that Coleman not only failed to understand the harm he had caused, but actively blamed the victims for the abuse they had suffered. Marlene removed the revolver from her purse with movements that she later described as feeling automatic and inevitable. Coleman's expression changed from dismissiveness to shock to terror in the space of seconds as he realized what was happening. He began to speak, possibly to plead or to apologize, but Marlene fired 3 shots in rapid succession before he could form coherent words. The first shot struck Coleman in the chest, puncturing his left lung and causing massive internal bleeding. The second shot hit him in the abdomen, damaging multiple organs and ensuring that even immediate medical intervention would be insufficient. The third shot, fired as he fell backward over his chair, struck him in the head and killed him instantly. The warning signs that Marlene had detected in Marcus during his 4th grade year would prove to be only the beginning of a devastating spiral that would ultimately transform a loving mother into someone capable of taking another person's life. What she couldn't have known was that her son was enduring a systematic campaign of racial harassment that would slowly destroy his sense of safety, belonging, and hope. The trouble began in earnest during the fall semester of Marcus's 4th grade year, when a new student named Tyler Richardson transferred to Jefferson Elementary. Tyler came from a family with a well-documented history of racial prejudice, though this information was not shared with school staff or other parents. His father, William Richardson, had been involved with various white supremacist groups throughout the 1990s and had passed down his toxic beliefs to his son. Tyler quickly identified Marcus as a target, recognizing that the bright, well-liked African-American student represented everything his father had taught him to resent. The harassment began with seemingly minor incidents: racial slurs whispered during hallway transitions, accidental collisions that sent Marcus's books scattering across the floor, and deliberate exclusion from playground activities that had previously welcomed him. Marcus's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, was a well-meaning educator in her final year before retirement, but she had grown complacent about classroom management and failed to notice the subtle patterns of abuse occurring under her supervision. When Marcus attempted to report the incidents, she dismissed them as typical childhood conflicts that the boys would work out on their own. The harassment escalated throughout the winter months. Tyler recruited several other students to join his campaign against Marcus, creating a hostile environment that followed him from classroom to cafeteria to playground. They would make monkey sounds when he walked by, leave racist drawings in his desk, and spread rumors they smelled bad or was dirty because of his skin color. Principal Robert Coleman, the man who would ultimately become Marlene's victim, was aware of the growing tensions but chose to handle them through what he called conflict resolution rather than acknowledging the racial nature of the harassment. Coleman had built a career on maintaining Jefferson Elementary's reputation as a harmonious, well-functioning school, and he was reluctant to admit that racial bullying was occurring on his watch. When Marlene requested meetings with school officials to discuss Marcus's declining academic performance and behavioral changes, Coleman consistently downplayed her concerns. He assured her that children at this age often go through difficult phases, and that Marcus would bounce back with time and patience. He never mentioned the reports he had received about racial incidents involving her son. The breaking point came in March 2018, during what would later be described in court documents as the bathroom incident. Marcus had been cornered in the boys' restroom by Tyler and 3 other students who forced him to his knees and urinated on him while calling him racial slurs. A 5th grade student witnessed the assault and reported it to his teacher, but the information somehow never reached Principal Coleman's desk. Marcus returned to class that day in borrowed clothes from the nurse's office, traumatized and humiliated beyond anything a 10-year-old should have to endure. When he tried to explain what happened to Mrs. Henderson, she suggested that he might have misunderstood the situation and advised him to focus on his schoolwork rather than dwelling on conflicts with other students. That evening, Marcus attempted to tell his parents about the incident, but the shame and trauma made it impossible for him to articulate what had happened. Instead, he began displaying signs of severe depression and anxiety that would intensify over the following weeks. He started having nightmares, wetting the bed, and begging to stay home from school with increasing frequency. Marlene's maternal instincts told her that something was seriously wrong, but every attempt to get answers in the school was met with reassurances that Marcus was simply going through a difficult adjustment period. She increased her volunteer hours at Jefferson, hoping to observe firsthand what might be affecting her son. But the bullying occurred primarily when adult supervision was minimal or absent. The final escalation occurred in early May 2018, when Tyler and his group cornered Marcus after school and beat him severely enough to require medical attention. They broke his nose, gave him a concussion, and left him with bruises covering most of his torso. The attack was witnessed by several other students, but fear of retaliation kept them silent. Marcus told the emergency room doctors that he had fallen down the stairs at school, a lie that protected his attackers but prevented his parents from understanding the true nature of his injuries. The attending physician noted in his report that the injuries seemed inconsistent with a simple fall, but did not pursue the matter further when Marcus insisted on his version of events. Principal Coleman's response to the incident was to suggest that Marcus might benefit from being homeschooled for the remainder of the academic year, framing it as a compassionate accommodation rather than an admission that the school had failed to protect him. He never launched a proper investigation into the assault. The summer of 2018 passed in a haze of therapy appointments and medical consultations as Marlene and David struggled to help their son recover from what they still didn't fully understand. Marcus had become a shadow of his former self, withdrawn, fearful, and reluctant to engage with the outside world. He refused to discuss returning to school. When the new school year began in September 2018, Marlene made the decision to enroll Marcus at a different elementary school in a neighboring district. The transfer required a significant financial sacrifice, as David had to take on a second job to cover the additional transportation costs. At his new school, Marcus began to show signs of recovery. His teachers were more attentive to signs of bullying. The student body was more diverse, and the administration had clear policy for addressing racial harassment. For several months, it seemed as though the family had put the nightmare of Jefferson Elementary behind them, but the trauma Marcus had endured continued to affect him in ways that became more apparent as he entered middle school. He struggled with trust, had difficulty forming friendships, and continued to experience anxiety and depression that required ongoing therapeutic intervention. The sound of gunshots in the main office area sent immediate shockwaves through the school building. Secretary Morrison's scream could be heard throughout the administrative wing, and several teachers who were between classes immediately implemented lockdown procedures that had been practiced but never used in a real emergency situation. Marlene made no attempt to flee or to hide what she had done. She placed a revolver carefully on Coleman's desk, walked to the main office area, and calmly informed Ms. Morrison that she should call the police and tell them that Robert Coleman is dead. Her demeanor was described by witnesses as unnaturally calm, almost detached from the magnitude of what had just occurred. The first police officers arrived at Jefferson Elementary within 6 minutes of Morrison's 911 call, finding Marlene seated in the main office waiting area with her hands folded in her lap. She made no resistance when they arrested her, and her only request was that someone contact her husband to arrange care for Marcus, as she wouldn't be coming home for a very long time. The school remained in lockdown for over 3 hours while police secured the crime scene and interviewed witnesses. Parents gathered outside the building in growing numbers, desperate for information about their children's safety and struggling to understand how violence had penetrated what was supposed to be a secure educational environment. Marcus was kept at his current school until David could arrange to pick him up, shielded from the immediate knowledge of what his mother had done in his name. The conversation they would have that evening, about justice and vengeance, about love and loss, about the terrible things that good people sometimes do when the system fails them, would mark the beginning of his long journey toward understanding. The media response was immediate and intense. Within hours, news vans surrounded Jefferson Elementary, and the story of the mother who shot the principal began spreading across social media platforms with speed that would have been impossible in previous decades. Public opinion was sharply divided between those who saw Marlene as a grieving mother pushed too far and those who viewed her as a dangerous vigilante. As Marlene sat in her jail cell that night, awaiting arraignment on charges of first-degree murder, she reportedly told her court-appointed attorney that she felt peaceful for the first time in months. She had given Marcus something that the legal system never could: the knowledge that someone had paid a price for the suffering he had endured. The legal proceedings against Marlene Washington began within hours of her arrest, but the case would prove to be far more complex than anyone initially anticipated. What seemed like a straightforward murder case quickly evolved into a national conversation about racial justice, institutional failures, and the limits of maternal protection when the system designed to safeguard children breaks down completely. District Attorney Patricia Williams was assigned to lead the case against Marlene. Williams initially viewed the case as clear-cut. Regardless of any grievances Marlene might have had against Principal Coleman, she had committed premeditated murder in a school setting, endangering hundreds of children and faculty members in the process. However, as the investigation progressed and evidence mounted, Williams found herself grappling with evidence that painted a far more complicated picture than she had expected. The discovery of Marcus's therapy records, combined with witness statements from former Jefferson Elementary students and their parents, revealed a pattern of institutional negligence and racial harassment that had been systematically ignored by school administrators for years. Marlene's defense team was led by prominent civil rights attorney Jonathan Hayes, who had built his reputation defending cases involving racial injustice and police brutality throughout the Southeast. Hayes recognized immediately that this case offered an opportunity to expose the systemic failures that had led to Marcus's suffering and, ultimately, to Coleman's death. The pretrial phase lasted 8 months, during which both sides gathered extensive evidence about the culture at Jefferson Elementary and the specific incidents involving Marcus. Hayes' team conducted interviews with dozens of former students, teachers, and parents, uncovering a disturbing pattern of racial harassment that extended far beyond Marcus's tragic experience. Multiple families came forward with similar stories of their children being bullied, harassed, and physically assaulted at Jefferson Elementary, with complaints consistently dismissed or ignored by Principal Coleman and his administrative staff. The pattern suggested not merely negligence, but active complicity in maintaining an environment where racial harassment was tolerated and victims were systematically silenced. The prosecution focused on the premeditated nature of Marlene's actions and the danger she had posed to the school community. They argued that taking the law into one's own hands and committing murder was never justified and set a dangerous precedent that could encourage vigilante justice throughout the community. Media coverage of the case was intense and polarized from the beginning. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForMarlene and #JusticeForMarcus, while supporters organized rallies and fundraisers for Marlene's legal defense across multiple states. The trial began on June 3, 2020. In the midst of nationwide protests following the death of George Floyd and renewed attention to racial injustice in American institutions. The timing was not lost on observers, who noted the parallel themes of institutional racism and the failure of systems designed to protect vulnerable populations. Hayes' defense strategy centered on what legal experts termed justifiable homicide based on institutional betrayal. He argued that Marlene's actions, while tragic, with a predictable result of a system that had not only failed to protect her son, but had actively enabled his abuse through willful negligence. The trial lasted 6 weeks and featured emotional testimony from Marcus himself, who described in heartbreaking detail the harassment he had endured and the lasting psychological trauma it had caused. His testimony was particularly powerful and moving to the jury. On July 17, 2020, after deliberating for 3 days, the jury returned a verdict of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, acknowledging that while Marlene's actions were criminal, they were committed in a moment of extreme emotional disturbance caused by adequate provocation. Judge Maria Santos sentenced Marlene to 12 years in prison, the minimum allowable sentence. During the sentencing hearing, Judge Santos acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances, while emphasizing that violence could never be condoned as a solution to systemic problems. Georgia Women's Correctional Institution, where Marlene Washington began serving her 12-year sentence in August 2020, houses approximately 1,800 inmates in a sprawling complex surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life dedicated to helping families and protecting children, the transition to prison life represented a profound psychological and emotional challenge. Marlene's arrival at the facility was noted by both inmates and staff, as her case had received extensive media coverage and many prisoners were familiar with her story. Unlike many inmates who enter prison with lengthy criminal histories, Marlene was viewed by many as someone who had been pushed to an extreme by circumstances that resonated with other women who had experienced systemic injustice. Her first cellmate was Jennifer Rodriguez, a 42-year-old woman serving time for drug trafficking charges related to her attempts to support her children as a single mother. Rodriguez later described Marlene as someone who was clearly struggling with the reality of her situation, but who maintained dignity and compassion. The first year of Marlene's incarceration was marked by severe depression and what prison psychologist Dr. Angela Foster diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder related both to her son's abuse and to the violent acts she had committed. Marlene struggled with guilt about leaving Marcus without his mother during such a crucial period of his recovery. Dr. Foster noted in her psychological evaluations that Marlene displayed none of the antisocial behaviors typical of violent offenders, but instead showed signs of someone grappling with the moral complexity of having committed an act of violence that she believed was necessary for justice. By her second year in prison, Marlene had begun to establish a routine that helped her cope with the institutional environment. She worked in the prison library, where her education and professional background made her a valuable resource for inmates pursuing their GED or college coursework. Marlene's relationship with Marcus during this period was maintained through weekly phone calls and monthly visits that were emotionally challenging for both mother and son. Marcus, now in middle school, was thriving academically and socially at his new school, but struggled with the complicated feelings about his mother's actions. The prison environment also exposed Marlene to stories of systemic injustice that paralleled her own experience in many ways. She befriended women whose children had been failed by child protective services, whose educational and economic opportunities had been limited by racial discrimination. During her third year of incarceration, Marlene began participating in a restorative justice program that brought together offenders and community members to discuss the impact of crime and the possibility of healing. Through this program, she was able to have a facilitated conversation with several teachers from Jefferson Elementary. These conversations were emotionally difficult, but ultimately healing for both Marlene and the teachers involved. Marlene was able to express her remorse for the terror and trauma she had caused while also sharing the depth of her son's suffering and her desperation when all legitimate avenues for justice seemed closed. By her fourth year in prison, Marlene had become a respected figure among both inmates and staff. She had completed multiple educational programs, including courses in conflict resolution, trauma counseling, and social justice advocacy. Her disciplinary record was exemplary. Her advocacy work extended beyond the prison walls through letters and interviews with researchers studying institutional racism in educational settings. Her case had become a touchstone for discussions about the failure of schools to protect minority students. As 2024 approached, marking the midpoint of her sentence, Marlene had developed perspective on her crime that balanced acknowledgement of its wrongness with understanding of the systemic failures that had contributed to it. As of January 2025, Marlene Washington remains incarcerated at Georgia Women's Correctional Institution, having served 4.5 years of her 12-year sentence. Now 46 years old, she has evolved from the desperate mother who walked into Jefferson Elementary with a loaded revolver into an advocate for systemic change. Marlene's daily routine reflects her transformation during her time in prison. She wakes at 5:30 a.m. for the mandatory head count, spends her mornings working in the prison library where she has become an invaluable resource for legal research and educational support. Her relationship with Marcus has strengthened significantly over the past 2 years as he has matured and developed a more nuanced understanding of the circumstances that led to his mother's actions. Now 17 years old and a senior in high school, Marcus visits his mother monthly, and they maintain regular phone contact. Marcus's recovery from his traumatic experiences at Jefferson Elementary has been remarkable, though he continues to work with therapists to process the complex emotions surrounding his mother's imprisonment. He has become an advocate for anti-bullying initiatives. David Washington has remained supportive of Marlene throughout her incarceration, visiting regularly and maintaining their marriage despite the enormous strain placed on their family. He has become a vocal advocate for educational reform. Marlene's case continues to resonate in legal and educational circles as an example of how institutional failures can lead to tragic outcomes when individuals feel they have no recourse through legitimate channels. The impact of her case has extended far beyond her own situation. Jefferson Elementary School underwent a complete administrative overhaul following Coleman's death, with new leadership implementing comprehensive anti-bullying policies. Marlene's memoir, which she has been working on for the past 2 years, is scheduled for publication in late 2025, with proceeds designated for organizations supporting victims of institutional racism and their families. Her psychological evaluations continue to show remarkable progress in processing the trauma and guilt associated with her actions. Her risk of reoffending is considered virtually non-existent. The possibility of early parole has become a topic of discussion among legal experts and advocates, with some arguing that Marlene's exemplary behavior and therapeutic progress make her an ideal candidate for early release. The story of Marlene Washington serves as a devastating reminder that the institutions we trust to protect our most vulnerable citizens can become instruments of harm when they fail to live up to their fundamental responsibilities. Her transformation from devoted mother and social worker to convicted killer illustrates the dangerous territory we enter when legitimate channels for justice are blocked. Marcus Washington's recovery and success demonstrate the resilience of young people when given proper support and protection. But his journey also highlights the lasting trauma that institutional failures can inflict on innocent children. The broader impact of this case extends far beyond the individuals directly involved. Schools across the nation have implemented new policies and procedures designed to address racial harassment more effectively and to ensure that parent concerns are taken seriously. Marlene's story challenges us to examine our own institutions and ask difficult questions about how we protect the vulnerable and ensure accountability when those institutions fail. While nothing can excuse the taking of a human life, Marlene Washington's case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our systems are not always sufficient to prevent tragedy when they are undermined by bias and negligence.